Hi there! Today I have another short story for you, and that is a short story by Sema Kaygusuz. The story is called Many Years Ago I Was Standing in a Meydan. It's a difficult story, but a good one, and I can't wait to get into it with you. Welcome aboard the International Express to Book Central. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's while away the journey with some book chat. I'm your host, Jules, something I think I remember to tell you about every third or fourth episode, but here we are, and I think I've officially declared December Short Story Month for myself. And as I was contemplating on what story to share with you today, my eye was once again caught by the collection of short stories by Sema Kaygusuz, which I've had for a number of years now, and I thought, hey, perfect time to get into one of those stories. The collection is called The Well of Trapped Words, and it's translated by Maureen freely. It's a great collection full of stories that draw on history, mythology, legends, folk tales, and they're written in a way that is very pleasant to read, if that makes sense. It does feel like someone is sharing their kind of folk history and different stories that they've heard with you. There is one story in this collection that stands out to me though, and that is the one I want to share with you today, called Many Years Ago I Was Standing in a Meydan. As a little content warning at the beginning, Sema is a Turkish writer, and this story does engage with the Kurdish and Turkish conflict, which kind of started in the late 70s and in many ways is still ongoing. It therefore also contains portrayals of death, war, violence, and violence that is also based on ethnicity. So it's not an easy context in which this story takes place. And I will go into this conflict a little bit later on, but I just wanted to give that warning in advance. With that said, let's get into the story. Our story starts in a barbershop, where our narrator, who is telling us the story in a kind of a first-person narration, is, I think, waiting to get his hair cut. But currently the barber is working away on an old man called Kekil. They're kind of trying to banter with this old man, and the barber says, hey, why don't we hook you up with this old widow, and then you can spend the remainder of your days just together in marital bliss. Usually, Kekil isn't really responsive to this kind of banter. He's a very solitary man, as we'll find out. But something here seems to trigger him. So he makes eye contact with our narrator in the mirror and says no. And then suddenly he launches into a story, which none of them have heard before and which none of them are entirely sure what to do with. You see, Kekil says that many years ago he was standing in a Meydan. And he was there surrounded by soldiers. He was only 12, but all the people of the Demenon tribe had been gathered in the village square. And he remembers seeing a woman there with a small infant. They'd all been surrendered to these soldiers, all the inhabitants of this village. And by the end, none of them were left. And so Kekil says, how dare you propose a woman to someone whose heart was broken, who was widowed at the young age of 12. So now it's a bit awkward. They're all standing there sitting there in this barber shop, and they're not sure how to respond. Not only has Kekil never really shared anything like this before, but it doesn't really fit with their understanding of this man. And it's not that they're trying to be rude, they just are a bit ignorant, the narrator says. They have no idea what to do. And although they all like listening to exciting, little bit distressing stories, this is a step too far. Kekil leaves the barbershop, puts on his jacket and just gets out, and it took a long time before our narrator saw him again. Our narrator, who remains unnamed, worked as a taxi driver, and about 20 years ago he saw this strange, slightly older man get off a bus at the bus terminal, just carrying a little suitcase, nothing else, and being interested, our narrator sat down next to him and was like, hey, who are you? What are you doing here? And the old man wasn't really forthcoming, but just wanted to know where he could maybe find a hotel, because he was going to be sticking around for a bit. Our narrator had just inherited a modest little house from his aunt, and so he said, actually, never mind about hotels, you can rent this house from me, how about that? And he brought him some furniture over, etc., and the man paid a full year's rent up front. However, when our narrator's wife tried to drop by the house to see if he needed anything kind of fixed up or cleaned, he sent her away, and he was a little bit rude about it. So they didn't really see the man for a couple of seasons until I think it's about time that we maybe try and get to know this man who's living in our house. So he goes over there and he finds out that this man, Kekil, has been letting all the stray, lame, blind, mangy dogs and cats from the neighborhood into his house. The house apparently stinks to high heaven. The cats are all over the place. And our narrator's like, oh God, it stinks in here. I don't know what to do. And he feels that Kekil maybe enjoys being surrounded by all this misery, by all these yapping and mewling animals who are kind of suffering from one thing or another, as if this man almost has a need for misery, is how the story says it. And so our narrator says, you know what, this is not for me. So he stays away, and anyone who asks him, hey, what's up with that man? He's like, I think he's cracked. He's got a screw loose. Kekil is very much staying away from everyone during that time. He doesn't take part in the census. He doesn't actually talk to his neighbors. He doesn't go to the post office or to the bank. Just every once in a while he hops on a bus and comes back with money. So of course there's all kinds of rumors about where he's getting his money from. Maybe he has shops in Istanbul, or maybe he found treasures and is selling them on the black market. But no one actually knows what this man is doing, what his history is, and what is going on. And that's kind of how the situation was for 20 years until that incident in the barbershop happened with which the story started. And our narrator kind of keeps thinking about this occurrence, and he's not quite sure what to do with it. And then a few weeks later, he once again sees Kekil, but now he's hobbling down the street. And Kekil is an elderly man, and our narrator is actually quite a nice person. So he goes up to him and is like, let's get you to a doctor. You've started limping. That's not good. But Kekil says, what's wrong with you? I have always been crippled. And our narrator's like, no, you've literally never walked like this before. What is going on with you? And then tears come into the man's eyes, and he starts telling a story about a mill and how they were all taken to the cliffs behind the mill, lined up in 3 rows, one behind the other. Kekil himself was in the 3rd row at the back, but his uncle Mustafa was at the front, and soldiers were aiming their rifles at them. His uncle spoke to those in line with him and said, when we get shot, let's fall back so that we can fall on top of those behind us and try and save them. And maybe that way we will make our way into heaven. One of the soldiers overhears him and gets tears in his eyes and becomes very affected by this, but nonetheless they fire. And so Mustafa falls, and he falls back onto his godson, and this godson falls back onto Kekil, and he's left lying there underneath his tribe. The soldiers are told to double check that everyone is dead and use their bayonets if not. And it is actually the soldier who was crying who finds Kekil and realizes he's still alive. So he stabs him in the leg and then just rolls him away. Our narrator hears this, and once again he's overwhelmed by this story. He doesn't know where it's coming from, and although a part of him doesn't believe it, another part of him really does, because he can kind of feel the strong emotion coming off Kekil. There is something there, but he's a stranger and they don't really know where these stories are coming from. They have no idea what happened to him when he was a child. So this story that he has now heard from Kekil is just playing on our narrator's mind. Then again, sometime later, he once again sees Kekil at the bus terminal, this time maybe just coming back from one of his trips. He sees that he has a dirty bandage around his right hand, and he says, "What's going on there? What happened?" And again, the man is like, I've told you what went wrong. And our narrator remembers, oh yeah, in the story he told me he'd been shot through the hand. That's what's going on here. And he says, okay, yeah, I remember, absolutely. And he kind of helps this man make his way through the terminal because he just seems to be getting older. He doesn't seem to be entirely sure where he was. And then suddenly Kekil starts talking about the dogs and about how it was the dogs that made him so sad. And the narrator asks, what do you mean? And he's like, well, the dogs got hungry, so they started eating the bodies. It took them days to get used to eating humans, but once they did, they got quite clever about it. And so our narrator thinks, yeah, I think it's time to take this man out of this terminal to a more private space. But Kekil keeps talking about the crying soldier specifically, about how he threw him down after having stabbed him in the leg, and how Kekil ended up hiding in the roots of a tree for days and nights, how he was thirsty and hungry, but how he made himself a little crawl space, created a little hollow in the earth, and stayed there for days and days, ignoring the insects that were crawling over him. And it's a very kind of painful description there in the story about the suffering that this man was going through, until suddenly he is found by a soldier. And he's not quite sure whether this soldier is the angel of death or the angel of revelation. And he realizes that it's that same soldier, the soldier that was crying. And he tells him, I'm hungry, in Turkish. And the soldier does give him some bread, but he passes out before he even knows if he ate the bread or not. Those are the last words that our narrator ever hears from Kekil. He kind of fades away, the older man, and pushes him back and staggers off back to the house. And the story says that as he staggered away, it seemed as if all the wounds from his childhood were opening up again. And it breaks our narrator's heart to watch him kind of stumble away. But he's not quite sure what to do. A few days later, they are awoken by barking dogs. And these are the dogs that Kekil had given a home in his house. Our narrator knows immediately that Kekil must have died, and so they go to the house and they find him there, and his face is oddly relaxed in death, as if all his memories have been erased. Then, of course, the bureaucracy of death comes to play. A death certificate has to be made, and there's something of a commotion because no one knows Kekil's surname. And the official says, okay, go find his identity card. So our narrator and his wife, Esma, have to go into the house and kind of rummage through all the things that are still there. Our narrator remembers the little suitcase Kekil had with him when he saw him for the first time all those years ago. And he finally finds it at the very back of a cabinet under piles of newspaper. He sees a pile of papers, an envelope, and the identity card is in the lining. The name on the identity card, however, is Nusret Karaman, who was born in Adana. Nothing about Kekil. And there are photos of the man and his wife and their children and their grandchildren, of holidays that they've taken together, eating food, making nice memories. Until he finds the very last photograph in the suitcase. And it is of a group of smiling soldiers, the bayonets sunk into the ground, just chatting. And the man that we knew as Kekil, but who's really called Nusret, is leaning towards his friend. And the story tells us that this man has yet to come eye to eye with a 12-year-old boy in a Meydan. The man in that photo knows nothing of Kekil yet. And on the back of the photo is written, Dezim, 1938, we vanquished every last Kurd. And that is how the story ends. So that is our story. It's not the easiest of stories, like I said. And in a sense that the fact that it's not easy is belied by the fact that it's written so smoothly. As you're reading it, it is written so simply, something which is, I think, incredibly hard to achieve probably as a writer. But it's written very simply, as if you can immediately imagine how these situations would have come about, how our narrator would feel. But then you're confronted with these very dark kind of war memories. And then it kind of switches back to normal life for a bit. And then once again, these war memories come up. And it's very disruptive, those dark memories. And I think that is very much the point of the story. In some of the interviews I've read with Sema Kaygusuz, to which I'll link in the description as well, she describes the way in which literature can function for a society, for a culture, for a country, how it can be a way of exposing certain social concerns to kind of hold up a mirror to a nation. And I think she speaks about it as a vehicle which can do that. And I think this story really shows how that works, because the normal everyday life of this village gets disrupted by these dark memories which come up. And then at the end it's revealed that actually the person they thought was a victim of these dark memories is actually a person who is haunted by the fact that they committed those crimes. And I think that's a very interesting twist. And I don't mean twist here in the kind of idea of like, ooh, twisty. I was looking forward to a kind of a nice, shocking reveal, and here it is. It doesn't work in that way. Or at least you can get that out of it, to be like, ooh, I didn't see that coming, exciting. But I think it's much more meant to bring home to you how violent war is, and how being a perpetrator of that kind of violence leaves an enormous stain on your consciousness as well. The man we know as Kekil is haunted by these things, and the things he's done are starting to kind of manifest in his own body. He starts limping, he has a wound in his hand, and he cannot get away from what he has done. And he feels this need to share it with others as well, without being able to really acknowledge his own role into it, which is why these stories kind of burst out every time our narrator is around, and he is then confronted with these things, but Kekil can never quite admit on which side he was. He's trying to hide this. His identity card and those photographs are shoved into the very back of the closet in the hope that no one will find it. And he has completely cut himself off from social contact. He's only surrounding himself with animals. And it makes for a very heartbreaking story, which then I think makes for a very complex reader response as well, because you felt bad for Kekil and you were empathizing with his experience. And then you find out he was the perpetrator, and it makes for a very complex reading experience, I would say. And I'm still very impressed with how Sema Kaygusuz manages to put all of that emotion, all of that background into kind of, I think it's about 7 or 8 pages, the story. It packs a real punch. And that's, I think, why the short story genre is such a fascinating and worthwhile genre, because it requires authors to keep it short, but to really consider, to really think about each and every detail that they put in there. And it allows, I think, for very powerful writing. And it also really allows for literature to kind of be that vehicle for a society, to be the mirror that gets held up, in which a culture or a country then has to ask itself what it thinks it's doing, what it thinks its past is. Like I said at the beginning, this story reflects upon the conflict between the Kurds and Turkey, which started in the 1970s, or in some ways it started a bit earlier. So we had the Ottoman Empire in the east of what I would roughly call Europe, to the east of that, and that fell apart at the beginning of the 20th century, at which point the Allies then decided to just divide up the land that was there between different parties. This meant that the Kurdish people ended up without a self-ruled region. They got in part added to the Republic of Turkey, but there are also still Kurdish areas within Iraq and Syria. So this basically meant that the Kurdish people, who are their own ethnic group, who are also Muslim, they ended up without a territory of their own. The tension which existed between the Kurdish regions and the Turkish government kind of really escalated in the last quarter or so of the 20th century. There was a state of emergency called out in the Kurdish provinces, and there was martial law in response to kind of separatist activities, and something of a guerrilla war took place. And this really led to the fact that in the 1980s and 1990s, the countryside was evacuated, thousands of Kurdish villages were destroyed, and there were executions, food embargoes, and a lot of Kurdish people were killed or forced to leave their homes during this time. This is something which I find difficult to talk about because some of it took part during my own lifetime, and it's not something I've ever really truly been taught about. I had a Kurdish classmate in high school, and that was how I then started finding out some of those things, but not really. Never really in a proper, thorough way. So still looking into it for this episode as well, I realized there's a lot more history there that I need to get into because it's very current still. Whether it was the Islamic State in Iraq trying to expand there, that was in some ways also linked to the Kurds who were living there. It might have provided them with an opportunity to maybe claim some territory back, but yet, of course, you don't necessarily want to be working with the Islamic State. The Syrian civil war also had an impact upon the Kurdish people, and in many ways they're still without a land and without a place that they can safely call home. So it's a very complex situation, one which I'm still trying to learn about, and I do apologize if I'm maybe not doing the conflict justice here. But for me, someone who reads a lot of literature, I find stories like this one by Sema Kaygusuz a very good way for me to initially find out about some of these things, but to also get a perspective of people who are dealing with those events, rather than getting an outside perspective through a textbook. I think a short story like this one can give readers like myself, who in many ways are very far removed from these events, a perspective into what it's like to deal with that history, to deal with the fact that is taking place in your own country. And perhaps I'm also a little bit more sensitive to that, being German. I, of course, also carry a big awareness of the crimes that were committed by my country in the not too distant past. So in a way, I'm sensitive to stories that engage with that sense of guilt, but also interest to dig deeper. So that's why I wanted to share this story with you as well, because it really makes me think, and it's a really good example, I think, of how literature can be a gateway into understanding a country, a culture, a society, how literature can be a way of exploring and working out certain social issues which otherwise maybe aren't talked about as much. And as an outsider, it gives me a greater understanding of things which otherwise just feel like historical events that are distant. This way it feels very personal, and it then gives me the opportunity to look further into it. I also have a little bit of a personal connection to this short story collection in a way. In 2019, I was still living in Shanghai, and Shanghai has a yearly Lit Fest. And I was very fortunate to attend a talk by Sema Kaygusuz about the Well of Trapped Words. And that's also where I picked up my copy of the collection. I was really impressed by the talk that she gave, how she talked about the way in which she wanted to bring together history, philosophy, as well as legend, myth, and folklore into her stories. And at the end, I asked her if she could write me a little recommendation of poets and philosophers to check out. And she very kindly wrote down that list on the last blank page of the collection. I've carried that collection with me the last 3 or 4 years, from country to country, with that recommendation list. And occasionally I will pick up a book based on her recommendation. And I found it a very nice way to thereby continue my own investigation into different literatures, different philosophers and poets, and to also gain a deeper understanding of her own writing, where she gets her inspiration from. So I can wholeheartedly recommend the collection, The Well of Trapped Words. It has a lot of very interesting stories. Many are also quite short, which means that they're quite easy to kind of fit into a busy schedule. and some are written from the first perspective, others from third perspectives. She also engages a lot with the position of women, the relationship between women and their bodies, their position in life, and I found it very eye-opening to read her work, so I can only recommend it. And that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.